The Wyoming wind had a voice, and for 3 days it had been whispering cruelties in Eloise Hartley's ear. It howled through the ill-fitting slats of the stagecoach, carrying a rain so cold and persistent it felt less like water and more like a liquid judgment from the heavens. Her fingers, wrapped in thin wool gloves, were numb sticks of ice. They were curled protectively around a small, dark wood box on her lap, the only tangible piece of the life she had been forced to abandon. Inside lay a mother-of-pearl locket, a pressed edelweiss from a book of poetry her father had once read to her, and a single lock of her own brown hair, snipped on the morning she'd turned 16, a lifetime ago. Beside the box, tucked into the folds of her skirt, was the other artifact of her existence, a single sheet of stationery, now yellowed and soft from countless readings. The script was bold, masculine, and economical with its words. It was a proposal of marriage from a man she had never met, Sheriff Abram Callahan of Barrows Hollow. His letters, exchanged over 6 months, had spoken of stability, of order in a wild land, of a respectable life for a woman of good breeding. He had offered her a future when her past had been irrevocably poisoned. She had accepted because there was nothing else. The hem of her dress, a modest gray serge bought with the last of her money, was torn and stained with the mud of a dozen way stations between Boston and this God-forsaken edge of the world. It was a fitting emblem of her own condition, respectable on the surface, but frayed and ruined underneath. She closed her eyes against the lurching of the coach, trying to conjure the man from his letters, a man of the law, a man of principle, a bulwark against the chaos she had fled. But the image was flimsy, and the wind tore it to shreds. "Almost there, ma'am," the driver grunted from his perch, his voice muffled by the storm. "That's Barrows Hollow, just yonder." Eloise forced her eyes open. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw it. The town was not so much built upon the land as it was clinging to it, a desperate collection of raw lumber and mud-chinked log buildings huddled against the maw of a vast canyon. It was a grim settlement, perched on the precipice of nowhere, surrounded by looming mesas that stood like ancient, silent sentinels. The wind here was not just a sound, it was a physical force, scouring the life from the landscape, leaving behind only rock, stubborn scrub, and suspicion. There were no gardens, no painted fences, no hint of the civilized softness she had once known. There was only the struggle, etched into the bowed shoulders of a man hauling a bucket from the town well and in the pinched, pale faces that appeared like ghosts in the windows as the stagecoach rumbled down the main. And only street. The coach groaned to a halt before a clapboard building that was larger than the others, distinguished by a stark, hand-painted sign, Sheriff, Jail. A man stood on the covered porch, arms crossed over his broad chest, waiting. He was tall and solid, his shoulders filling out his coat in a way that spoke of undeniable strength. This had to be him, Sheriff Abram Callahan. Eloise gathered her small box and the letter, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that this was her salvation. She was a doctor's daughter. She knew how to compose herself, how to present a calm and pleasant face to the world, no matter the turmoil within. The driver opened the door, and a blast of frigid, wet air assaulted her. She stepped down, her worn boots sinking into the thick, sucking mud of the street. "Miss Hartley," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was a low rumble, flat and devoid of the warmth she had imagined from his letters. "Sheriff Callahan," she replied, forcing a small, polite smile. She extended a hand, a gesture of Boston propriety that felt foolish and out of place the moment she did it. He looked at her gloved hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was powerful, his fingers thick and calloused. It was a handshake of ownership, not of welcome. His hands were strong, she thought, just as she had expected. But they were impersonal, like the stone of the canyons that surrounded them. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, assessed her from head to toe, lingering on the torn hem of her dress with a flicker of distaste. He was younger than she'd pictured, perhaps 35, with a square jaw and light brown hair cut severely short. He was a handsome man, in a harsh, unyielding sort of way. "The Reverend is waiting at the church," he said, releasing her hand. He made no move to help with her small trunk, which the driver was now wrestling from the top of the coach. "The storm is worsening. We'll get it done quickly." He turned and led the way, his long strides forcing her to almost run to keep up. The townspeople stared openly now. Women paused with their market baskets, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Men leaning against the general store lowered their heads to whisper to one another, their gazes following her like predators. She felt a hot blush of shame creep up her neck. She was a spectacle. A mail-order bride arriving in a storm, her future husband the town's jailer. The church was a small, simple structure, the raw pine of its pews smelling of the forest. The Reverend was an old man with a kind, watery gaze that seemed to take in her exhaustion and fear. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken in a monotone against the drumming of the rain on the roof. Abram's responses were clipped and efficient. When he placed the thin gold band on her finger, his touch was cold, his hands utterly steady. She felt a tremor in her own, a deep, primal shudder of wrongness she could not name. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Abram did not kiss her. He simply took her elbow and guided her back out into the wind. Their new home was his old home. 2 rooms attached to the back of the jailhouse. The main room served as a kitchen and sitting area, dominated by a cast-iron stove and a plain wooden table. It was obsessively neat, stark, and without a single personal touch, save for a rifle mounted above the hearth. Through a doorway, she could see the small bedroom, and through another door, the barred corridor of the jail itself. There were no prisoners at the moment, but the faint, metallic scent of iron and despair lingered in the air. "This is it," Abram said, dropping her trunk by the door. "The bedroom is through there. I have rounds to make." He left without another word, pulling on his oilskin coat and disappearing into the gray afternoon. Eloise stood alone in the oppressive silence of the room, the howling of the wind her only companion. She ran a finger over the cold metal of the wedding band. She was Mrs. Abram Callahan. She was safe. She was respectable. She repeated the words to herself like a prayer, but they felt like a lie. That night, the lie unraveled completely. After a tense, mostly silent meal of beans and salted pork that Abram had cooked, he retired to the bedroom. Eloise stayed by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea, her entire body rigid with apprehension. She could hear the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as he paced, the sound of a bottle being unstoppered, the low, angry muttering that was too faint to be understood but clear in its simmering rage. What was he angry about? Her torn dress, her trembling hands, her very existence? Finally, he called her name. The sound was thick, slurred. "Eloise, get in here!" Her blood ran cold. She rose on unsteady legs, her movements stiff and slow, as if wading through molasses. She entered the bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, stripped to his trousers, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. The air was heavy with the scent of liquor and something else, something acrid and dangerous. In the flickering lamplight, his face was a mask of dark discontent. "Took you long enough," he grumbled. His eyes narrowed. "Think you are too good for this? Too good for me?" "No, of course not," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was just tidying." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Tidying? You think that's what I brought you all the way out here for? To tidy?" He stood up, and the room suddenly felt impossibly small. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He reached for the collar of her nightgown, his fingers fumbling with the small buttons. His touch was not passionate. not even rough in a way that spoke of urgent desire. It was aggressive, a violation of her space, an assertion of power. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated fear washed over her. This was not the promise of his letters. This was something else entirely, something dark and twisted that had been hiding behind his carefully chosen words. "Please," she said, her voice shaking as she pushed weakly at his chest. "Please, can we wait?"
"Wait?" he snarled, his face contorting. "I've waited 6 months for you to get here. The waiting is done."
His hand, which had been fumbling at her collar, balled into a fist. She saw the change in him, the shift from a brutish man to a predator. A deep, instinctual alarm screamed inside her head. This was not just wrong. It was dangerous. She pushed at him again, this time with all her strength. "No, stop!" The sudden defiance seemed to enrage him. His eyes, which had been clouded with drink, cleared for a moment into points of cold, hard fury. "You will do as you're told." When she shoved him a third time, trying to scramble away, his hand flew up. The blow was swift and brutal, a crack of sound that echoed the thunder outside. It caught her high on the cheekbone, snapping her head to the side. Stars exploded behind her eyes, and a sharp, metallic taste filled her mouth. The shock of it was as painful as the impact itself, the sheer, unvarnished violence from the man who was supposed to be her protector. For a frozen second, there was only the ringing in her ears and the hot, blossoming pain on her face. Then, adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through her veins. She did not think, she acted, while he was off balance, surprised by his own action or her lack of immediate collapse. She darted past him, out of the bedroom and toward the main door. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers slick and uncooperative. He roared her name from behind her, the sound of a beast unchained. The latch gave way. She wrenched the door open and plunged barefoot into the raging storm. The cold was a shock, the mud an icy grip on her feet, but she did not feel it. She only felt the desperate, frantic need to run. The thin cotton of her nightgown was instantly soaked, clinging to her skin like a shroud. Rain and tears blinded her, but she ran, fueled by a terror so profound it eclipsed all other sensations.
"Finch!"
she heard Abram bellow from the jailhouse porch.
"Get after her, now!"
A moment later, she heard the heavy tread of boots slogging through the mud behind her, and a man's voice shouting for her to stop. The deputy. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw his lantern swinging wildly in the dark, a malevolent yellow eye hunting her. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her bare feet screaming in protest as they met sharp stones and unseen obstacles in the darkness. She left the relative safety of the street and scrambled toward the canyon's edge, thinking only of escape, of finding a place where they could not follow. The land fell away into a labyrinth of canyons and ravines, a treacherous landscape made lethal by the storm. She stumbled down a narrow, rocky path, the wind trying to tear her from her feet. The deputy's shouts grew fainter, then louder again. As he navigated the terrain behind her, she could not outrun him for long. Panic clawed at her throat. She was trapped. Her foot slipped on a patch of wet rock. She cried out, her arms flailing as she pitched forward. Her body slammed against the ground, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She slid through mud and gravel, coming to a stop with her legs dangling over an abyss. Below her, there was nothing but a roaring blackness where the storm winds echoed like the cries of the damned. She clung to a thorny bush, its thorns digging into her palms, her knuckles white. The deputy's lantern appeared above her on the path. He was closing in. This was the end. She would be dragged back to that room, to that man. And then, another light appeared, a steadier, calmer light, coming from the opposite direction along the canyon rim. It was a lantern held high, illuminating the silhouette of a man on horseback. The horse was a great, dark beast, and the man sat upon it with an unnatural stillness, as if he were a part of the storm itself.
That's far enough. Finch!
A low voice cut through the wind. It was a voice that held the gravel of the canyon floor and the cold of the rain.
The deputy froze, his own lantern beam swinging toward the rider. "Wolf," he spat, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and bravado. "This is sheriff's business. Stay out of it."
"The sheriff's business is beating his new wife on their wedding night," the man called Wolf replied. His tone was deceptively soft, yet it carried an edge that made the hairs on Eloise's arms stand on end.
"She's a runaway,"
Finch stammered, taking a hesitant step back. "He wants her back." The rider dismounted in a single, fluid motion. He was tall, leaner than Abram, and moved with a quiet grace that was more dangerous than any overt threat. He took a step forward, and the light from his lantern caught the hard planes of his face, a sharp jaw shadowed with stubble, dark, unreadable eyes, and a mouth set in a grim, unforgiving line. "She's not going back with you." Finch's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "I have my orders, Wolf."
"And I'm giving you a new one,"
the rider said, his voice dropping even lower.
"Go home."
For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the storm raging around them. Eloise could feel the bush she was clinging to begin to give way. A small cascade of pebbles skittered into the darkness below. Finch saw it. His eyes darted from the rider to her, and then back again. Whatever he saw in Cassian Wolf's face was enough. With a curse, the deputy lowered his lantern, turned, and began the treacherous climb back toward the town. The rider, Cassian Wolf, watched him go. Only when the deputy's light had disappeared did he turn his attention to Eloise. He walked to the edge of the cliff, holding his lantern out over the void. Its light fell on her pale, terrified face, on her bleeding hands and torn nightgown. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding a darkness that seemed to mirror the abyss below. He said nothing. He simply knelt, reached down with one long arm, and gripped her wrist. His hand was large and calloused, but his grip, for all its strength, was surprisingly steady. He pulled her up from the edge with an ease that belied the precariousness of her position. She collapsed onto the muddy path, shivering uncontrollably, a pathetic weeping heap at his feet. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He did not speak a word of comfort. He simply turned, retrieved his horse, and led it to her side. With another economical movement, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and set her on the saddle in front of him. He swung up behind her, his body a solid wall of warmth against her back. He wrapped a coarse wool blanket from his saddle roll around her trembling shoulders and then, taking the reins, urged the horse into the darkness, away from Barrow's Hollow, away from the cliff, away from everything. The journey was a blur of shadows and the steady, rhythmic plodding of the horse. He took her deeper into the wilderness, following paths that were invisible to her. He offered no words of comfort, no explanation, only the heat of his body, the shelter of the blanket, and the silent, inexorable movement away from her terror. Hours later, or perhaps it was a lifetime, they arrived at a small, isolated cabin tucked into a grove of pine trees, nearly invisible against the dark bulk of the mountainside. He dismounted, lifted her down, and carried her inside. The cabin was a single room, sparse and fiercely clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a cot in the corner. He set her down in a chair before the cold fireplace and, without a word, began to build a fire. Soon, flames licked at the dry wood, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. Eloise sat huddled in the blanket, watching the fire, the tears finally coming. They were not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent. Hot tears that tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Tears for the hope she had lost, for the shame that burned hotter than the bruise on her face, for the utter, terrifying aloneness that was now her entire world. She was bruised, but as the warmth of the fire began to seep into her frozen limbs, She felt a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance flicker within her. She was not broken. From the shadows across the room, Cassian Wolf watched her. He leaned against the far wall, his face half hidden in darkness. He did not speak, did not move to comfort her. He just watched, a silent guardian or a silent captor. She did not know which, and in the flickering firelight, she saw that his hands, resting on the table before him, were trembling, his knuckles white, as if he were holding back a legion of his own ghosts. Eloise woke to a world of gray and white. The first thing she registered was the sound of the wind, a mournful, relentless howl that found its way through 100 tiny cracks in the cabin walls. It was a sound of profound loneliness. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, offering a gentle warmth that was a stark contrast to the biting cold she had endured the night before. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a thick, scratchy wool blanket. Her body ached with a deep, bone-weary soreness, and when she raised a hand to her face, her cheek was tender and swollen, a painful reminder of Abram's touch. Slowly, she sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. Her borrowed nightgown, torn and mud-stained, was gone. In its place, draped over a chair, was a man's flannel shirt, worn soft with use, and a pair of trousers, far too large for her. Her own ruined dress was nowhere to be seen. A strange and unsettling intimacy settled over her. This silent, violent man had undressed her while she slept, yet she had not been harmed further. She had been kept warm. It was a contradiction her mind could not yet resolve. The cabin was empty. The man, Cassian Wolf, was gone. Cautiously, Eloise swung her legs off the cot, her bare feet meeting the cold, rough-hewn floorboards. The single room was larger than it had seemed in the flickering firelight. It was a space stripped down to the bare necessities of survival. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Along one wall, a shelf held a few tins of coffee and flour, a stack of pewter plates, and a half-dozen worn books, their spines cracked and faded. A well-oiled rifle and a shotgun were mounted above the door, their polished steel gleaming faintly in the dim morning light. There were no curtains on the single window, no rugs on the floor, no paintings on the walls. It was a place built for shelter, not for comfort. Yet it was not dirty or disordered. Everything had its place. The stack of firewood beside the hearth was perfectly aligned. The pelts of beaver and fox in the corner were neatly bundled. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, deliberate life. A rhythmic, percussive sound drew her to the window. Peering out, she saw him. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in a pristine, solemn layer of snow. Against this white canvas, Cassian Wolf stood, methodically splitting logs. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. With each swing, the axe head bit deep into the wood, the sharp crack echoing in the frozen air. He moved with a focused, economical grace, his body a well-honed tool for the task at hand. He seemed completely at one with the harsh landscape, as much a part of it as the pine trees and the ancient, snow-dusted rocks. He never once looked toward the cabin. It was as if he knew she was watching, and he was determined to ignore her. A tremor of fear, a leftover from the night, ran through her. Who was this man? A savior? A kidnapper? She had run from a monster only to find herself in the lair of... what? She needed to know. While the steady thud of the axe continued outside, she began her own quiet search. Not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to understand her situation. She did not pry deeply, but her eyes scanned the room for clues. In a small, crudely made chest at the foot of his bed, she found only spare clothes and ammunition. But in the drawer of the small table beside his cot, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled it out. It was an old wanted poster, the paper brittle and brown with age. The sketch was of a younger man, his face leaner, his eyes wilder, but it was unmistakably him.
Beneath the drawing, the words were stark and chilling. Wanted, Cassian Wolf, for murder and bank robbery. Reward, $500. She stared at the word murder, and a fresh wave of cold washed over her, colder than the snow outside. She had been saved by a wanted killer. She quickly folded the paper and put it back, her hands trembling. The sound of the axe outside suddenly seemed more menacing. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Cassian remained a creature of silence and routine. He would hunt, chop wood, and mend his gear, all with a grim, focused intensity. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. There is stew on the hearth. The fire needs more wood. Do not wander far from the cabin. He never met her eyes, his gaze always directed at some point just over her shoulder, as if looking at her directly was a transgression he could not afford. Eloise, however, could not remain idle. It was not in her nature. Her father, a Boston surgeon, had instilled in her a belief in purpose and utility. To be useless was a kind of death, and so she began to carve out a place for herself in the small cabin. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom. She washed their plates in the bucket of melted snow he brought in each morning. She found his sewing kit and mended the tear in his shirt. And she cooked, using the sparse provisions. She made stews and baked dents, serviceable bread in a Dutch oven over the fire. These small domestic acts were her anchor in a sea of uncertainty. They were a way of asserting her presence, of proving that she was more than just a victim to be sheltered. One afternoon, while sweeping near the hearth, the broom head caught on a loose floorboard. Curiosity, a trait she had in abundance, got the better of her. She knelt and worked her fingers into the crack, prying the board up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. She hesitated for only a moment before lifting it out. Inside, she found two things. The first was a Bible, its leather cover worn smooth and soft from countless hands. The second was a photograph, a tintype of a woman with a gentle smile and kind eyes, holding a small boy of about 4 or 5 on her lap. The boy had Cassian's dark, serious eyes. She stared at the image, at the ghost of a life that seemed impossible for the silent, hard man who lived here now. A wife, a son, this hidden cache of tenderness, tucked away beneath the floor, was a secret history that stood in stark contrast to the wanted poster in the drawer. He was a man of violent contradictions. She carefully wrapped the items and placed them back, sliding the floorboard into place just as she heard his footsteps approaching the cabin door. The talking began on the 4th night. A blizzard had descended, trapping them inside, the world beyond the cabin's walls erased by a swirling vortex of snow. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the small room felt like the last bastion of life in a dead world. Cassian had been staring into the fire for over an hour, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. Eloise watched him, sensing a storm within him that rivaled the one outside. "You should not have run toward the canyon," he said suddenly, his voice a low rasp. "That was a fool's choice." The unexpected words startled her. "I was not thinking," she confessed quietly. "I was only running." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "I know what it is to run like that." A fragile bridge of words had been built between them in the roaring silence. Eloise dared to take a step across it. "The poster in your drawer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It says you are a murderer." He did not flinch, did not seem surprised that she had found it. He merely turned his head and, for the first time, looked directly at her. His eyes were dark pools of ancient pain. "Some men deserved killing," he said, his voice flat. "But the one they want me for, he was just a boy, a bank teller. He was scared, and my partner was drunk, and I was not fast enough to stop it." He paused, the memory playing out behind his eyes. "I used to ride with the Black Creek gang. We took what we wanted. I thought it was freedom.
But freedom built on other people's fear is just a bigger cage. He fell silent, but the story hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. "What happened?" she asked softly. "A job went wrong. Fire. There was bloodshed I could never wash off, no matter how far I rode." He looked away then, his gaze drifting toward the floorboards near the hearth, where the photograph was hidden. He said nothing of the woman or the child. That part of his past remained locked away, a wound too deep to be exposed to the air. The confession seemed to drain the tension from him, leaving him looking weary and hollowed out. Now, it was her turn. It was only fair. "My father is a surgeon in Boston," she began, her own voice trembling slightly. "He is a good man, a respected man. He had expectations for me." She told him everything about the charming suitor, a wealthy merchant who had courted her with poetry and promises, about the stolen moments in the public garden, the innocent meetings that had felt so thrillingly illicit, and about the discovery that he was married, a fact he had conveniently omitted. His wife, a woman of great social standing, had created a scandal so vicious, so complete, that it had destroyed Eloise's reputation overnight. She was branded a temptress, a homewrecker. Her friends abandoned her. Her own father, a man who valued his standing above all else, had looked at her with shame in his eyes. He had not disowned her with anger, but with a quiet, devastating disappointment that was far worse. Coming west as a mail-order bride had not been an adventure. It had been an exile. When she finished, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She expected judgment, or perhaps pity. She got neither. Cassian just watched her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "He lied to you," Cassian said simply. "And your father chose his good name over his own daughter. The shame belongs to them, not to you." His words, so simple and direct, struck her with the force of a physical blow. In all the months of her disgrace, no one had ever said that. No one had ever placed the blame where it belonged. They had all looked at her as the fallen woman. But this man, this killer and outlaw, saw the truth of it. In that moment, the fear she held for him began to recede, replaced by something warmer, something more complex. The dynamic in the cabin shifted after that night. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared space. They began to talk more, about small things, the books on his shelf, the way the snowdrifts formed against the cabin, the taste of the rabbit stew she had learned to make. He was surprised to discover the depth of her education, the quickness of her mind. She possessed a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments. A flash of the vibrant woman she had been before scandal and fear had muted her. One evening, she picked up a tattered copy of a book of poems from his shelf. "My father used to read this to me," she said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "Read some now," he'd said, his voice quiet. She hesitated, then opened the book. She began to read, her voice soft at first, then growing stronger as the rhythm of the words took hold. It was a poem about the sea, about loss and endurance. Cassian sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, but she knew he was not focused on the task. She could feel his eyes on her. When she glanced up, she saw that he was not looking at the book. He was watching her lips as they formed the words, his expression one of rapt, unguarded attention. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her chest. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, Eloise began to feel something akin to safety. It was a fragile, tentative feeling, but it was there. This small cabin, which had at first felt like a prison, was beginning to feel like a sanctuary. This silent, haunted man was becoming her unlikely protector. The world outside, with its cruel judgments and its violent sheriffs, seemed very far away. But the world has a long reach. In a town like Barrows Hollow, rumors spread faster than fire in a dry prairie. Sheriff Abram Callahan, stewing in a potent brew of public humiliation and private fury,
had wasted no time in crafting his own version of events. His bride, a delicate creature from the East, had been driven half-mad by the hardships of the frontier. She had run off in a state of delusion on their wedding night, and the notorious outlaw, Cassian Wolf, had taken advantage of her madness, kidnapping her for his own foul purposes. He was a pillar of the community, and his word carried weight. He fanned the flames of fear and suspicion that always lingered around the solitary man in the mountains. Abram, shamed and furious at being defied, used his authority to reopen old wounds. He officially declared Eloise abducted and posted a new bounty, not for an old murder, but for a new crime. Cassian saw it a week after the blizzard. He had ridden down from the mountain to check his traps near the edge of his territory. It was nailed to a massive pine tree that marked the informal boundary between his wilderness and the lands closer to town. The paper was new, a stark white slash against the dark, ancient bark. The ink was black and bold, the words designed to incite. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the snow, and read the notice that would shatter their fragile peace. Wanted, it read in thick, block letters. Cassian Wolf, for the abduction and assault of a bride, Mrs. Eloise Callahan, $1,000, alive. He stared at the words, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords of rope. Abduction and assault. The very crimes Abram himself had committed, now laid at Cassian's feet. Abram had not just put a price on his head, he had stolen Eloise's truth, twisting her escape into an act of violation and painting her savior as her tormentor. The past, which Cassian had tried to outrun for so long, had finally caught up, and this time, it had brought a whole new hell with it. The wanted poster felt like a block of ice in Cassian's hand, its cold seeping straight into his soul. He had carried it back to the cabin, the crisp paper a declaration of war he could not ignore. He tacked it to the wall beside the door, a stark and ugly testament to the world he had tried, and failed, to leave behind. Eloise watched him, her hands twisting in the folds of the flannel shirt she now wore as a dress. The fragile peace they had built over the past week had shattered the moment he walked through the door, his face a mask of stone. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. The look in his eyes was the same one he'd worn the night he pulled her from the cliff's edge, the look of a man staring down a familiar darkness. He did not answer, merely tapped a finger on the poster. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. Abduction, assault, $1,000. Her stomach churned. Abram's lies, printed in bold, accusatory ink for the entire world to see. "He is twisting everything," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "They will not believe him. I will tell them what he did." "And who will they listen to?" Cassian's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "The respected sheriff, or the runaway bride he claims is half mad? You have no standing here. Eloise, no one to speak for you." He turned from the poster and began to move about the cabin with a grim purpose, gathering a bedroll, a canteen, and a small sack of provisions. "What are you doing?" she asked, a new, more urgent panic rising within her. "I am taking you back," he said, his back to her. "I will leave you at the edge of town. You will go to the Reverend. Tell him you got lost in the storm. Tell him anything you want, but this ends now." "No!" The word burst from her, sharp and desperate. "You cannot. He will kill you. Cassian, $1,000 will bring every greedy man with a gun out of the woodwork. You will not even make it to the town limits." "That is my concern, not yours." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were cold, shuttered. He was rebuilding the wall between them, brick by painful brick. "I brought this trouble to your door. I will not bring more blood to mine." "You did not bring this trouble," she cried, stepping toward him. "You saved me from it. This cabin, this is the only place I have felt safe since I left Boston. Please, do not send me back there." Her voice broke on the last word. The thought of facing Abram again,
of seeing the whispers and the stares, of being trapped in that suffocating little town, was more terrifying than any wanted poster. "Safe?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think you are safe with me? Look at that paper. That is what I am. Trouble. A ghost that brings other ghosts. I have a past that does not stay buried. Being with me will get you killed. Or worse, it is better you face the devil you know." He believed it. She could see it in the rigid set of his jaw, in the self-loathing that burned in the depths of his eyes. He truly believed he was a poison, a contagion from which she needed to be saved. No amount of arguing would change his mind. His decision was not about logic. It was a penance he felt he had to pay. The next morning, they left at dawn. The air was bitingly cold. The snow on the ground crisp and loud under the horses' hooves. Eloise rode in front of him, her back stiff, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The silence between them was a chasm, filled with unspoken fears and the ghosts of the confessions they had shared. He had retreated completely into the solitary man she had first met. His hands on the reins impersonal, his body a rigid wall behind her. They followed the winding game trails down from the high country, avoiding the main path. The world was a study in black and white, the dark trunks of the pines against the endless snow. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant hawk, sent a jolt of anxiety through Eloise. She scanned the trees, her eyes searching the shadows, expecting to see the glint of a rifle barrel at any moment. The ambush came in the late afternoon, in a narrow pass flanked by a high, rocky ridge on one side and a thick stand of aspen on the other. There was no warning. One moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the horses breathing. The next, the world exploded in a deafening crack of gunfire. A bullet whizzed past Eloise's head, so close she felt its heat, and slammed into the trunk of a tree beside her. The horse reared, screaming in terror. Cassian reacted instantly. There was no hesitation, no thought. His left arm snaked around her waist, pulling her from the saddle in a rough, protective embrace. He threw them both off the horse, using his own body to shield her as they hit the snowy ground. Get behind the rocks," he roared, shoving her toward a cluster of granite boulders. He had already drawn his pistol, his eyes scanning the ridge from where the shot had come. Another shot rang out, kicking up a spray of snow just inches from his feet. Eloise scrambled behind the rocks, her heart pounding in her ears like a war drum. She peered over the edge just in time to see two men emerge from the trees on the ridge above, rifles in hand. They were rough-looking men, their faces obscured by thick beards and pulled-down hats. Bounty hunters. "Give it up! Wolf!" one of them yelled, his voice thin and reedy in the cold air. "The sheriff wants you alive. Makes no difference to us, but it ought to you." Cassian did not reply. He fired a single, calculated shot toward their position. It was not meant to hit, but to make them take cover. A chip of rock exploded near the first man's head, and both of them ducked back behind the trees. "He is just one man," the second one shouted. "Let us rush him." "Stay put," Cassian yelled at Eloise, his voice a low, urgent command. He knew they were pinned. The men had the high ground. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. He had to create a diversion, a chance for them to escape. He broke from cover, running in a low crouch toward the stand of aspens, firing as he went. It was a desperate, foolish move, meant to draw their fire. And it worked. Both rifles on the ridge barked in unison. Eloise saw Cassian stumble, a grunt of pain torn from his lips. He clutched at his left shoulder, his forward momentum carrying him a few more feet before he collapsed behind the thin cover of the trees. "He is hit!" the first man crowed from the ridge. "He is ours now!" Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Eloise's panic. She would not let them take him. She would not let him die for her. While the bounty hunters were focused on Cassian's position, she did the only thing she could think of. She scooped up a large, heavy rock and hurled it with all her might down the opposite side of the pass, into a thicket of dry brush.
It crashed through the branches with a loud, startling noise. "What was that?" the second man yelled. Startled. "Is there someone else?" It was the hesitation Cassian needed. He staggered to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. He motioned frantically for her. "Now!" he mouthed. She ran. She scrambled from behind the boulders, her feet slipping in the snow, and plunged into the aspens where he waited. He grabbed her good hand with his grip surprisingly strong. "This way," he rasped, pulling her deeper into the trees. They could hear the bounty hunters shouting in confusion behind them, but they did not stop, did not look back. They ran. Cassian leading her through the dense woods, his breathing harsh and labored, a dark red stain spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his coat. He led her to a place the bounty hunters would never think to look, an old, abandoned silver mine. Its entrance a dark, gaping wound in the side of a hill, half hidden by overgrown bushes. "In here," he panted, pushing her toward the darkness. "They will not follow us in." The air inside was cold and dead, heavy with the smell of damp earth and forgotten things. The darkness was absolute. Cassian leaned heavily against the rock wall just inside the entrance, sliding to the ground. Eloise could hear his ragged breaths, the soft drip of water somewhere in the deep blackness of the mine shaft. He fumbled in his coat pocket and produced a small tin of matches and a candle stub. With trembling fingers, he struck a match. The sudden, tiny flame seemed impossibly bright, pushing back the oppressive darkness just enough for her to see the reality of his wound. His entire left shoulder was soaked in blood. The bullet had gone clean through, but he was losing blood fast. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice sounding strangely calm in her own ears. It was her father's voice, the calm, clinical tone he used in the face of injury. She helped him shrug out of his heavy coat, her hands gentle. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping him as the movement tore at the wounded flesh. By the flickering candlelight, she tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat and then, carefully, cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole in the muscle of his shoulder, but it was the landscape around it that made her pause. His chest and back were a roadmap of past violence, a long, thin scar sliced across his ribs, the work of a knife. A puckered, round scar near his collarbone told of another, older bullet. There were other, smaller marks, faded and white against his skin. Each one a story. Each one a piece of the man he was. Her hands, guided by a memory of watching her father work, moved with a newfound purpose. She pressed the clean cloth against the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. He flinched at her touch, his body going rigid, but he did not pull away. "Hold this," she instructed, her voice soft but firm. He pressed his good hand over the makeshift bandage. She tore another strip of cloth and began to wrap it tightly around his shoulder and chest, creating a pressure dressing. Her fingers brushed against the scarred skin, tracing the history of his pain. He was so still, his breathing the only sound in the cavernous silence. "What does each one mean?" she whispered, her fingers hovering over the long, pale scar on his ribs. A muscle in his jaw jumped. "A card game in Wichita," he said, his voice a low growl of pain. "I was accused of cheating." "And were you?" A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes." Her fingers moved to the round scar near his collarbone. "And this one?" His smile vanished. "A lesson," he said, his voice hardening. "About trust." He would say no more. She finished tying the bandage, her hands lingering for a moment on his uninjured shoulder. The tension in the small, candle-lit space was thick enough to breathe. It was a tension born of pain, of fear, of a vulnerability neither of them had ever intended to show the other. He was wounded, dependent on her. She was a caregiver, a healer. The roles they had been forced into had been stripped away, leaving only a man and a woman, alone in the dark. He looked up at her,
his dark eyes shadowed with pain and something else, something she could not name. It was raw, unguarded. In that moment, she saw past the killer, past the outlaw, and saw only the man, haunted and hurting. She leaned in, her intention only to offer some small, human comfort. But as her face drew close to his, the air between them crackled. The kiss was not tender. It was a collision, a raw, tentative meeting of lips in the cold darkness of the earth. It was hungry, born of adrenaline and the stark, terrifying proximity of death. It was not a kiss of love, but of necessity, an affirmation that they were both still alive, still breathing. His good hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. Her hands rested on his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy beat of his heart beneath his scarred skin. It was a desperate, searching kiss, a question asked in the dark, and for a moment, the world outside, the bounty hunters, the lies, the town, ceased to exist. Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. He pulled back, a shudder running through his body. A look of confusion, of fear, crossed his face. This was a line he had never meant to cross. She saw the self-recrimination in his eyes, the belief that he had taken advantage of her, of the situation. She pulled back too, her own heart hammering, her lips tingling. They had stepped to the edge of a different kind of cliff, and, for now, they both chose to step back. They did not speak of it. She helped him to his feet, and they moved deeper into the mine, seeking a place to rest that was further from the entrance. They found a small, dry cavern off the main tunnel and made a small, smokeless fire with the dry wood he carried in his pack. He sank to the ground, his back against the rock wall, his face pale and drawn in the firelight. Eloise sat a few feet away, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged with the memory of their kiss. Later, as the fire burned low, he finally succumbed to exhaustion and pain, his head slumping to his chest. Eloise kept watch, listening to the sounds of the night, to the wind whistling at the mouth of the mine. She must have drifted off, because she was startled awake by a sound from him. It was a low, guttural moan, a sound of pure agony. In the faint, dying light of the embers, she saw that he was asleep, but it was not a peaceful sleep. He was trapped in a nightmare. His body was tense, his good hand clenching and unclenching. He muttered words she could not understand, fragments of terror. "Fire! Get him out! No! No!" And then, a sound that chilled her to the bone, the imagined cry of a small child, a cry that was cut short. His hands shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist in a grip of iron. His eyes were still closed, but he was lost in the horror of his dream. She gasped, not in pain, but in surprise. The grip was tight, desperate, the grip of a drowning man. His eyes snapped open. For a second, they were wild, unseeing, filled with the ghosts of his nightmare. Then they focused on her, on his hand locked around her wrist. A look of absolute, soul-deep horror washed over his face. He let go of her as if her skin had burned him, scrambling back, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. "I am sorry," he choked out, his voice raw with self-loathing. I would never." He saw himself as a monster, and this, to him, was the proof. He had put his hands on her in violence, even in sleep. Eloise did not pull away. She did not scream or cry. She simply looked at him, at this broken, terrified man, and her heart ached with a compassion that surprised her with its intensity. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his trembling hand. "It is all right," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor in his sea of torment. She understood. She knew what it was to be haunted. "I have been afraid in the dark, too." Meanwhile, back in Barrow's Hollow, the town was a hornet's nest of rumor and speculation.
Abram Callahan had called a town meeting in the general store, the air thick with the smell of kerosene, coffee, and public opinion. He stood before them, a figure of righteous authority, and told his story of the delicate, unstable bride and the predatory outlaw who had stolen her away. Many of the townsfolk nodded along, their faces grim. They were decent people who believed in order, and the sheriff was the symbol of that order. They looked at Cassian Wolf's solitary existence in the mountains with suspicion. He was an outsider, a man with a known past. It was easy to believe the worst of him. But not everyone was convinced. Jedediah Smith, the owner of the livery stable, a man with kind eyes and a memory as long as a winter night, spoke up. "I do not know about all that, Sheriff," he said, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl. "But I do remember 2 winters back, when the Miller boy chased that ball of his out in front of a runaway freight wagon. It was Wolf who came out of nowhere and snatched that child up, not a second to spare. Did not seem like the work of a man who preys on the weak." A murmur went through the crowd. Others remembered it, too. They remembered the quiet way Cassian had returned the crying child to his mother, refusing any thanks before melting back into the shadows. It did not fit with the picture Abram was painting. The town was divided. Into this division, a new, more dangerous element arose. A group of ranchers from the South Ridge, led by a hard-faced man named Silas Croft, grew impatient with the debate. They were men who believed in a simpler, more direct form of justice. "If the sheriff cannot bring him in, we will," Croft declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous certainty. "We will not have men like Wolf living in our hills, stealing our women. We ride at dawn." A half-dozen men voiced their agreement. They would be a posse, but a posse with no badge, no law to answer to but their own. They were vigilantes. Back in the cold silence of the mine, Cassian heard her words, and something inside him that had been frozen for a very long time began to thaw. She was not afraid of his darkness. She had offered him not judgment, but understanding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile bride, but a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had faced her own demons and survived. In that moment, he realized the futility of his plan. He could not run from his past. He could not protect her by pushing her away. Running was what had cost him everything before. It would cost him her, too. The bounty hunters, the vigilantes. Abram, they would not stop. You cannot heal a wound by pretending it is not there. You had to clean it, even if the cleaning burned like fire. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "We cannot run forever." He looked at her, his gaze steady, a new resolve hardening his features. "We have to go back, together." It was no longer about him saving her or leaving her to her fate. It was about facing the lies, facing the town, and facing the past, side by side. He was done running from his ghosts. It was time to turn and fight them. The journey back to Barrows Hollow was a descent into a colder, more deliberate kind of hell. They traveled only under the cloak of darkness, the moon a sliver of bone in a sky of infinite, star-flecked black. Cassian's wound, though no longer bleeding freely, was a constant, throbbing presence. He rode with his jaw set, his body canted to favor his injured shoulder, a grim silence radiating from him that was deeper than any they had shared before. It was the silence of a man heading willingly toward his own execution. Eloise, riding behind him now on the same horse, felt the shift in him, in them. On the flight from town, he had been the protector, his body a shield. Now, the roles were subtly reversing. She was the one who watched the trail, who listened for the telltale crunch of snow that was not their own, who insisted they stop so she could check his bandage and force him to drink water. He submitted to her care with a quiet, almost weary resignation, as if the fight had already gone out of him. But she knew better. It was not surrender. It was a gathering of strength, a focusing of will for the battle to come.
They arrived at the edge of town 2 nights later, stopping in a thick copse of pine that overlooked the sleeping settlement. Barrows Hollow was a collection of dark, silent shapes, a single yellow light burning in the window of the sheriff's office like a baleful eye. The sight of it sent a tremor of pure dread through Eloise. "You are sure about this?" Cassian's voice was a low rumble beside her ear, his warm breath misting in the frigid air. "There is still time to ride north. We could be in Montana territory in a week." "And then we would spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders," she replied, her own voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "No, the lies stop here. We end this where it began." He gave a single, sharp nod. The plan was simple and desperate. He would wait here, hidden. She would go into the town alone and find the one person she could think of who might listen, who might stand as a bastion of reason in a town ruled by fear. Reverend Kane. In her letters to Abram, she had mentioned her father's name and profession, and the sheriff had replied that the Reverend had also come from the East and had spoken of knowing of Dr. Hartley's work. It was a flimsy, desperate thread of a connection, but it was the only one she had. She slid from the horse, her legs stiff and cold. Cassian dismounted and handed her a dark, heavy wool cloak. "If he will not help you," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "Or if you feel for 1 second that you are in danger, you walk out of that church and you do not look back. I will be watching. I will see you. He will help," she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. She pulled the hood of the cloak low over her face and began the walk into town. Each step was a battle against her own terror. The main street was deserted, the mud frozen into hard, treacherous ruts. The wind whispered down from the canyons, carrying the ghosts of her first night here. She felt like a specter, haunting the scene of her own destruction. She reached the small, unadorned church and slipped through the unlocked door like a thief in the night. The interior was cold and smelled of old wood and beeswax. A single lantern burned near the altar, casting long, dancing shadows. Reverend Kane was on his knees, his back to her, lost in prayer. She waited, her heart in her throat, until he finished and rose slowly, his old bones creaking in protest. "Reverend," she whispered. He turned, his eyes widening in shock as she lowered her hood. "Mrs. Callahan," he breathed, his hand going to his chest. "Good heavens. Child, we thought the sheriff said you were taken." "I was not taken. Reverend, I fled," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And the man who helped me is now a hunted man because of it. Sheriff Callahan, he is not the man he pretends to be." The Reverend's face, a roadmap of weary piety, sagged with a sorrow that looked ancient. He motioned for her to sit in the front pew. "Tell me everything," he said. And so she did. She told him of her arrival, of Abram's coldness, of the terror in the bedroom, of the blow to her face. She told him of her desperate flight and of Cassian Wolf finding her at the edge of the abyss. As she spoke, she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes war with a deeper, sadder understanding. "My father, Dr. Alistair Hartley," she said, her voice catching. "He told me once that a man's character is not revealed in his words, but in his hands, what they choose to build and what they choose to break. Abram Callahan's hands were meant to break me." At the mention of her father's name, the Reverend's expression softened. "I knew of your father," he said quietly. "I attended a lecture of his once, in Philadelphia. He was a brilliant man, a man of principle. It is hard to believe his daughter could be what the sheriff claims." He looked at her, at the fading bruise on her cheek, at the raw determination in her eyes, and a decision settled over him. "You cannot stay here. Abram has men watching the church, but I know someone who can help." He led her out the back of the church, through a small, frozen garden, to a modest house at the edge of the town's cemetery. He knocked on the door, a specific, coded rhythm. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s. her hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a severe bun. She was holding a shotgun with a casual ease that spoke of long familiarity.
"Mary Ruth,"
the Reverend said. "This is Eloise Callahan. She is in need of sanctuary." The woman, Mary Ruth, lowered the shotgun, and her sharp, intelligent eyes took in Eloise from head to toe. There was no pity in her gaze, only a calm, measuring assessment. "The sheriff's runaway bride," she stated, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You have caused quite a stir." She opened the door wider. "Get inside, both of you, before you catch your death." Her home was warm and smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. Mary Ruth, they quickly learned, was a widow whose husband had been the town's blacksmith. She was a woman who saw everything, heard everything, and held her tongue until it was time to speak. She listened without interruption as Eloise repeated her story. When Eloise had finished, Mary Ruth nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "I believe you," she said simply. "I buried my friend Martha 2 years ago. Her husband was a drinker, with a heavy hand. Abram was deputy then. He called Martha's death an accident, said she fell down the stairs. I never believed it. I have seen the same darkness in Abram's eyes that I saw in her husband's." She looked at Eloise, a fierce solidarity in her gaze. "There are other stories, too. Whispers. Women who have been bruised, in spirit if not in body, by his authority. He is a man who likes to feel powerful, and fear is the easiest way to do it." The revelation settled in the quiet room, a confirmation of the evil Eloise had only glimpsed. She was not the first. "The man who helped you," Mary Ruth said. "Where is he?" "Hiding. In the woods, overlooking the town. He will freeze to death out there, or Silas Croft's vigilantes will find him. Bring him to my barn after midnight. He can hide in the hayloft. No one will think to look for him here." And so, under the cover of the deepest dark, Eloise slipped back out of town and led Cassian to the relative safety of Mary Ruth's barn. He moved like a shadow, his pistol drawn, every sense on high alert. He surveyed the hayloft, the exits, the angles of approach, his mind mapping the tactical reality of their new prison. "This is a good place," he finally conceded, his voice low. He looked at Eloise, his gratitude a palpable thing in the darkness. "You did well." Over the next 2 days, the barn became their world. Mary Ruth would bring them food and news from the town. The vigilantes had ridden out and found Cassian's cabin empty, which only fueled their certainty of his guilt. The bounty hunters had returned to town, spreading tales of his ferocity. Abram was growing more confident, more arrogant, certain he had won. In the quiet hours, by the light of a single, carefully shielded lantern, Eloise began to write. She took the foolscap and ink the Reverend had provided, and she began to construct her testimony. She wrote not with passion, but with a cold, surgical precision her father would have recognized. She detailed the dates and contents of Abram's letters, the exact words he had spoken to her upon her arrival, the events of their wedding night, moment by horrifying moment. She described the feeling of the wind on her bare feet as she ran, the sight of the deputy's lantern hunting her in the dark. She wrote of Cassian's intervention, of the wound he had suffered protecting her. She poured her truth onto the page, transforming her fear and shame into a weapon. When she was done, Reverend Kane came to the barn and, after reading it, affixed his signature and the church's seal, notarizing it as a sworn statement. Cassian watched her, a silent, brooding presence in the hayloft. Being confined was a special kind of torture for him. He was a man of action, of open spaces, and now he was reduced to hiding in the shadows, dependent on the courage of others. His wound was healing, but his confinement chafed at him. He would watch from the cracks in the barn wall as Eloise walked with the Reverend or Mary Ruth in the yard, and a fierce, primal protectiveness would surge through him. It was a feeling so potent it frightened him. It was more than a sense of duty. It was a deep, unspoken longing that he fought to keep chained down. He had lived his life believing his hands were made only for violence, He was terrified that his desire for her, this raw, desperate thing that had been growing since the moment he touched her in the mine, would overwhelm his control, and he would somehow harm her, just like every other man in her life had. He would not be that man. On the third night, a deep, bitter cold descended. They sat huddled together in the hayloft for warmth. A single thick blanket wrapped around both of them. The silence was charged, filled with everything they had not said. She could feel the tension in him, the coiled strength of his body, the war he was fighting with himself. "You are afraid," she whispered into the darkness. "I am not afraid of them," he growled, his voice a low vibration against her back. "I know," she said, turning to face him in the gloom. "You are afraid of this, of me." He did not deny it. He just looked at her, his face a landscape of shadows and longing. The control he had maintained for so long was beginning to fray. "When you touched me in the mine," she continued, her voice soft but unwavering, "it was the first time a man's touch did not feel like a threat. Even the way you grabbed my wrist in your sleep. It was not a desire to harm. It was a desire not to be alone in the dark." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. He flinched, but did not pull away. A shudder went through him, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am not made of glass, Cassian," she whispered, "and you are not a monster." That was all it took. The dam of his control broke. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time there was no desperation, no frantic hunger of survival. It was slow, a deep, searching exploration. It was rough in its honesty, the kiss of a man who had forgotten gentleness but was trying to remember. He laid her back in the sweet-smelling hay, his body a warm, heavy weight upon hers. They moved together with a clumsy, necessary grace, shedding layers of clothing, layers of fear, layers of loneliness. They shivered in the cold air, not from the chill, but from the raw, terrifying vulnerability of letting themselves feel something so unguarded, so completely. It was not a claiming, but a discovery, a quiet, desperate act of finding solace in a world that had offered them none. The next morning, the world came for them. Eloise awoke first, nestled in the warmth of Cassian's arms, a feeling of fragile peace settling over her for the first time in her life. The pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the walls. And then she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, of men's voices, sharp and official, in the yard below. Cassian was awake instantly, his body going from sleep to lethal alertness in a heartbeat. He was already reaching for his pistol when the barn doors were thrown open with a crash.
"Cassian Wolf!"
It was Abram's voice, booming with triumphant authority.
"By the authority of the territory of Wyoming, you are under arrest. Come out with your hands empty."
They were surrounded. Someone had talked. A tip-off. Betrayal. Cassian looked at Eloise, his eyes filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. If he fought, they would both die. If he surrendered, she might live. His choice was made before he even thought it. He holstered his pistol and pressed a quick, hard kiss to her lips. "Do not let him win," he whispered. He stood up and walked to the edge of the hayloft, his hands raised in surrender. Eloise watched in horror from the shadows as two deputies scrambled up the ladder and bound his hands behind his back with iron shackles. They dragged him down and out into the cold morning light, a prize to be paraded before the town. Eloise crept to the barn window, her heart shattering. She saw him standing there in the yard, proud and defiant even in chains. And she saw Abram, a smug, victorious smirk on his face as he looked up toward the hayloft, his eyes seeming to pierce the shadows and find her. He knew she was there. This was his victory lap. Later that day, he made his public spectacle. He gathered the townsfolk in the street in front of the jailhouse. He stood on the porch, a figure of righteous power, while Cassian stood behind him, shackled and silent.
"The outlaw, Cassian Wolf, has been apprehended,"
Abram announced, his voice ringing with false piety.
This man, this murderer, preyed upon my wife in a moment of weakness. He filled her head with lies, took advantage of her fragile mental state, a madness brought on by the hardships of this frontier, which her delicate constitution could not endure. He is a predator who belongs behind bars, or at the end of a rope."
The crowd murmured, their opinions swaying like wheat in the wind. Some looked at Cassian with hatred, others with a flicker of doubt. They were a pendulum, and Abram had just given them a powerful push. From the window of Mary Ruth's house, Eloise watched, her fists clenched, her knuckles white. She had her statement, her weapon, clutched in her hand. Her moment had come. With Mary Ruth and the Reverend flanking her like sentinels, she walked out of the house and straight toward the crowd. A path parted for her as she walked, the whispers following her like a flock of crows. She did not stop until she was at the foot of the jailhouse steps, standing directly before her husband. She ignored him, her eyes finding Cassian's through the bars of the jailhouse window behind the porch. His expression was unreadable, a mask of iron control. "Sheriff Callahan is a liar," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden, shocked silence. The crowd turned as one to stare at her. This is the truth. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. Her hands trembled, making the paper in her grasp rattle. But she took a deep breath, looked out at the sea of faces, curious, hostile, sympathetic, and began to read. "My name is Eloise Hartley Callahan. I arrived in Barrows Hollow on the 10th of November. Her voice cracked on the first few words. A tremor of fear she could not suppress, but she did not break. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and continued to speak her truth to the town that had come to judge her. The town hall in Barrows Hollow was not a courthouse. It was a large, drafty room that served as whatever the town needed it to be. A dance hall on holidays, a polling place on election days, and now a theater for a trial that had gripped the settlement in a fever of speculation and judgment. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the slanted afternoon sun that cut through the tall, grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of stale sweat, old wood, and cheap tobacco, and heavy with the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Eloise sat on a hard, unforgiving bench between Reverend Cain and Mary Ruth. Her hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the man in the defendant's chair. Cassian sat with his shoulders squared, his hands resting on his knees. He looked not at the crowd, not at the jury, but straight ahead, his face a stoic mask that betrayed nothing of the storm she knew was raging inside him. Across the room, Sheriff Abram Callahan sat beside a slick, hired lawyer from Cheyenne. A self-satisfied smirk played on Abram's lips. He was in his element, the center of attention. The puppeteer who believed he held all the strings. The judge, a man named Elias Thorne, was a circuit judge from a larger district, a weary-looking official with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, who seemed to view the entire proceeding with an air of profound exhaustion. But the jury, 12 men pulled from the town's own populace, ranchers and merchants and the livery stable owner, they were the ones who mattered. Their faces were a mixture of grim curiosity and hardened prejudice. They were Abram's neighbors. They were Cassian's judges. The trial began, a slow, grinding affair. Abram's lawyer painted a lurid picture of a depraved outlaw, a man with a dark past who had preyed on a vulnerable, mentally unstable woman. He called witnesses who spoke of Cassian's reclusive nature, of the years he had lived apart from the town, fueling the narrative of a dangerous outsider. He twisted Eloise's education into a sign of cunning and deceit, her flight into a calculated seduction. Through it all, Abram smirked, his polished badge glinting on his chest, the very picture of wronged authority. Then it was the defense's turn. Reverend Cain was the first to take the stand. He spoke in a calm, clear voice that commanded respect. He spoke of Eloise's character, of her father's reputation as a man of science and integrity. He presented the sworn statement she had written, his voice ringing with conviction as he read her words describing the assault. "I have been a minister of God for 40 years," he concluded, his gaze sweeping over the jury. "I know the sound of truth, and I know the stench of a lie. The testimony you hold in your hands is the truth." Mary Ruth followed. She was not intimidated by the lawyer's condescending questions. She stood tall, her voice sharp and clear as a winter morning. She told the story of her friend Martha, the woman who had fallen down the stairs. "Abram Callahan has a history of protecting violent men and blaming their victims," she stated, her eyes locking onto Abram's. "He sees a woman's fear not as a thing to be soothed, but as a thing to be used." The smirk on Abram's face faltered. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The most crucial witness, however, was Deputy Finch. He shuffled to the stand, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face pale and sweaty. He was a weak man, a man who followed orders, and he was visibly terrified of his boss. He gave a halting, evasive account of the night of Eloise's escape, sticking to Abram's version of events as best he could. But on cross-examination, the Cheyenne lawyer, for all his bluster, was unprepared for Judge Thorne's quiet, incisive questioning. The judge peered at Finch over his spectacles. "Deputy," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "you are under oath. You say you pursued Mrs. Callahan into the canyons. You say you encountered the defendant, Mr. Wolf. At any point during this encounter, did Mr. Wolf draw his weapon on you?" Finch swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced at Abram, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "Well, Your Honor, he was menacing." "That was not the question." "Deputy," the judge pressed, his voice hardening slightly. "The defendant is accused of assault and abduction. Assault with a deadly weapon is a serious charge. Did he, or did he not, draw his firearm?" The silence in the room was absolute. Finch squirmed, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. Finally, his gaze fell on Cassian, who was watching him with a flat, unwavering stare. Whatever Finch saw there, pity, perhaps, or simply a reflection of his own cowardice, it was enough to break him. "No, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "He never drew his weapon. He just told me to go home." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Abram's face flushed a dark, mottled red. It was the first deep crack in the foundation of his lies. Finally, Cassian was called to the stand. He rose and walked to the witness chair, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. He moved with a quiet deliberation that was more powerful than any swagger. He took the oath, his voice low and steady. Abram's lawyer began his attack, his questions dripping with sarcasm and accusation. He brought up the old wanted poster, the charges of murder and robbery. "Are you not, in fact, the man described on this poster, Mr. Wolf, a killer, a thief?" "I was that man," Cassian replied, his voice even. "I am not that man now." "And we are supposed to believe that a leopard can change its spots. What happened, Mr. Wolf? Did you simply wake up one morning and decide to be a good citizen?" Cassian was silent for a long moment. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the small, worn, tin-type photograph. He held it in his calloused hands, his gaze fixed upon it. "I had a brother," he began, his voice dropping, forcing the entire room to lean in to hear him. "His name was Samuel. He was 7 years younger than me. He smelled of summer dust and wild mint, and he thought I was the grandest man in the world. He followed me everywhere." He looked up from the photo, his dark eyes finding Eloise's for a fleeting second before sweeping over the faces of the jury. "When I left home, I fell in with the Black Creek Gang. I thought it was a grand adventure. We were free, but the things we did, they followed us. A rival gang, a dispute over a score. They came for us in the night, at a small ranch house where we were holed up. They set it on fire." His voice grew thick, raw with a pain that was a decade old but as fresh as a new wound. brother, Samuel. He had run away from home to find me, to be like me. He had arrived that very afternoon. He was sleeping in the barn. Cassian's composure finally broke. A single, hard tear tracked a path through the dust on his cheek. I tried to get to him, but the fire, the smoke, I could hear him screaming. He stopped, his throat working. The courtroom was so quiet. The sound of a man weeping in the back row was clearly audible. The boy on that old wanted poster died in that fire, Cassian said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He died with my brother. I left that life because I had seen the price of it. I came here to be left alone, to live a life where my hands did not cause any more harm. I did not abduct Mrs. Callahan. I pulled her back from the edge of a cliff, where her husband's cruelty had driven her, and that is the God's honest truth. He finished, and the silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of his confession. Eloise watched as Jedediah Smith, the livery owner who sat on the jury, openly wiped his eyes with the back of his rough hand. The trial was no longer about a simple case of abduction. It was about two men, two kinds of darkness, and the woman who stood between them. The judge called for a recess before the closing arguments, to allow the jury to eat. Cassian was led back to the small holding cell at the back of the jailhouse. Eloise, her heart aching for him, managed to persuade the deputy, a new, younger man who looked at her with a kind of awe, to let her see him for just a moment. She found him standing at the small, barred window, staring out at nothing. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by his testimony. She came to stand beside him, the iron bars cold between them. "You were brave," she whispered. He shook his head, not looking at her. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes, that is the bravest thing a person can do." She reached through the bars, her fingers gently touching his hand. He did not pull away. "Eloise," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "After this, whatever happens, you should get as far away from this town, and from me, as you can. I am a ghost. I will only ever bring you trouble." "No," she said, her grip on his hand tightening. "You are wrong." She looked at his hands, those large, calloused, scarred hands that had pulled her from the cliff, that had been wounded for her, that had trembled as they held her in the dark. "All my life," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of feeling, "I have been taught to fear men's hands. My father's were for his work. Impersonal. The man in Boston, his were deceitful. Abrams, his are for breaking things." She met his gaze, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have never known desire without also knowing fear. Not until you—" She gave a small, shaky laugh. "It is a terrible, wonderful thing. I cannot resist your hands, Cassian, because they have never once tried to take—" A look of profound, heart-stopping wonder crossed his face. In that moment, through the cold iron bars, he saw not pity, not gratitude, but a love as fierce and as real as his own pain. He brought his other hand up to cover hers, their fingers lacing together through the bars. The verdict came an hour later. The jury filed back in, their face grim and unreadable. Jedediah Smith, the livery owner, had been chosen as the foreman. He stood, holding a small piece of paper, and refused to look at either Cassian or Abram. "On the charge of abduction," he read, his voice raspy, "we find the defendant, Cassian Wolf." He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "Not guilty." A collective sigh went through the room. Eloise's knees went weak with relief, and she gripped Mary Ruth's arm for support. "On the charge of assault," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant not guilty." Abram Callahan shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is a farce," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the jury. "You are a pack of sentimental fools. He has bewitched you all." "That is enough. Sheriff Callahan." Judge Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. Abram fell silent, his chest heaving. "In light of the testimony given in this courtroom," the judge continued, his gaze cold and hard as iron,
specifically that of Deputy Finch and Mrs. Mary Ruth, concerning not only this case but your past conduct. I am hereby removing you from your post, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal. Deputy, he called to the younger man at the door, take this man's badge and his firearm. The entire courtroom watched, stunned into silence, as the disgraced sheriff was stripped of his power. His face, which had been contorted with rage, crumpled into a mask of pure, pathetic disbelief. He was no longer a figure of terror, just a small, bitter man whose lies had finally consumed him. Amid the chaos, as people began to talk all at once, Cassian was released. He stood for a moment, disoriented. In the middle of the room, his gaze swept over the crowd, past the people congratulating him, past the ones who still looked at him with suspicion, and found Eloise. He looked across the courtroom, and for the first time in his adult life, he saw someone looking back who knew the worst of him and had chosen to stand by his side. He was not alone. The quiet, powerful understanding that passed between them was more real, more binding than any verdict. But the scars of the town remained. As they walked out into the cool evening air, the victory felt fragile. Some of the townsfolk tipped their hats to them, their faces filled with a newfound respect. They praised Eloise's courage. They clapped Cassian on his good shoulder. But others, the ones who had sided with Abram, turned their backs. They whispered behind their hands as Eloise passed, their eyes cold and judgmental. They called her tainted, a troublemaker, the outlaw's woman. The trial was over, but the court of public opinion was still in session. Later that night, in the quiet warmth of Mary Ruth's kitchen, the weight of it all began to settle on them. "We should leave," Cassian said, his voice low. He was staring into the fire, the old instinct to run rising in him like a tide. "There is nothing for us here. We can go north, start over where no one knows our names." Eloise looked at him. She saw the familiar ghost in his eyes, the belief that escape was the only answer. But something had changed in her. She had found her voice in that courtroom. She had faced down her fear and had won. Running felt like a betrayal of that victory. "My whole life has been about running, Cassian," she said softly. "I ran from scandal in Boston. I ran from Abram. I am tired of running." She looked around the small, warm kitchen, a place where strangers had become her staunchest allies. "I want to build something, maybe not here, not in Barrows Hollow, but not by running away either. The past will always be there. I want to learn how to live with it, not just outrun it." He looked at her, at the quiet strength that radiated from her, and he knew she was right. But the thought of staying, of facing the whispers and the stares every single day, felt like a cage of a different kind. He wanted to protect her, and his only known method of protection was to disappear. She wanted to stand her ground, and for the first time, he was not sure he was strong enough to stand with her. The wind that scoured the edge of the Wyoming canyons had a memory. It was the same wind that had torn at Eloise's thin nightgown, the same mournful howl that had been the soundtrack to her terror. Now, weeks later, it whipped the heavy wool of her cloak around her legs and pulled strands of hair from her braid. But it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a witness. They stood together on the very precipice where he had found her, the place where her old life had ended and this new, uncertain one had begun. Below them, the canyons fell away into a labyrinth of shadow and stone, the last rays of the setting sun painting the high mesas in hues of blood and gold. They had ridden out from town in silence, the unspoken question of their future hanging between them, as vast and as empty as the landscape itself. Cassian stood a few feet from the edge, his gaze lost in the immense distance. The trial was over, but the verdict of the town was a wound that continued to fester. He had spent his life as a ghost, an outsider, and for a few fleeting days in that courtroom, he had felt like a man among men. Now, the whispers and the cold shoulders had pushed him back into the familiar wilderness of his own isolation. "We could be gone by morning,"
he said, his voice low, almost carried away by the wind. "Jedediah would sell me 2 good horses for a fair price. We could follow the Green River north, find a valley where no one has ever heard the name Wolf or Callahan. We could be new." He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the desperate, simple hope of a man who believed that a change of scenery could change the soul. "I am ready to leave it all behind, Eloise, if you are." She looked at him, at this man who had faced down bounty hunters and his own demons, and saw that his oldest and most stubborn enemy was his own past. She walked to his side, her shoulder brushing against his arm. "I once thought that was all I wanted," she said softly. "To erase everything, to be a blank page. But the past is not a place you can ride away from, Cassian. It is not written in the dust of the trail. It is written here." She placed a hand over his heart, feeling it steady, strong beat beneath his shirt. "It is in your scars. It is in my memories. It will ride with us, no matter how far north we go." A look of weary defeat crossed his face. "Then what are we to do? Stay here and let them stare at us until we turn to stone?" "No," she said, her voice firm, filled with a strength she had not known she possessed until she had to use it. "We do not run from it, and we do not let it turn us to stone." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "The past will never leave us, but we can learn to carry it differently. Together." She looked out at the vast, unforgiving beauty of the land. "I am not the same woman who ran through these canyons in fear, and you are not the same man who lived alone in the mountains. We can build something here, something the whispers cannot tear down." He looked down at their joined hands, at her slender, pale fingers intertwined with his own, which were calloused and scarred. He had always seen his past as a burden that would eventually poison anyone who came too close. She saw it as something to be carried, a weight that could be shared. It was a terrifying, revolutionary idea. He looked at her face, illuminated by the last fiery light of the sun, and for the first time, the thought of staying did not feel like a cage. It felt like a challenge. They did not settle in Barrows Hollow. The town was a wound that would be too slow to heal. Instead, with the help of Jedediah Smith and a small loan from a surprisingly generous Mary Ruth, they acquired a 160-acre parcel of land 5 miles upriver, in a wide, sheltered valley where the wind blew a little softer and the soil was dark and rich. It was a place where a person could put down roots. They started with 1 room and a fireplace. The work was hard, a relentless battle against the elements and the limitations of their own bodies. Cassian, with a lifetime of solitary competence, felled the trees and hewed the logs, his axe ringing out in the clear, cold air from dawn until dusk. Eloise, her hands soft from a life of books, learned to mix mud and straw for the chinking, her muscles screaming in protest at the end of each day. They worked side by side, a rhythm of shared labor replacing the need for words. In the evenings, they would collapse before their newly built hearth, too tired to speak, and simply watch the flames, their presence a quiet comfort to each other. As the cabin took shape, so did a new life. Eloise, remembering the scattered, isolated ranches they had passed, saw a need. There were children in these hills who lived a day's ride from the schoolhouse in town, children growing up as wild and untaught as the landscape. She rode out to the neighboring homesteads, a quiet determination in her eyes. She spoke to the wary mothers and skeptical fathers, and with the quiet endorsement of Reverend Kane, she offered to teach their children to read and write. Her school was a corner of their 1-room cabin. She had 3 students at first, then 5, then 7. They were shy, rough-hewn children with calloused hands and a deep suspicion of book learning. But Eloise was patient. She taught them not just with books, but with stories of the world beyond the canyons, with lessons drawn from the flight of an eagle or the changing of the seasons. She taught them sums by counting cattle and stones. She found a purpose that had nothing to do with her name or her past, a purpose built on the simple, powerful act of opening up the world for a child. While she nurtured minds, Cassian nurtured the land. He built corrals. The clean, straight lines of the fences a testament to a newfound order in his life. The rhythmic work of his hands, which had once known only the cold steel of a pistol and the rough grip of reins on a desperate flight, now learned the texture of wood, the heft of a hammer, the satisfaction of building something meant to last. He learned the seasons for planting, the patience of waiting for a crop to grow. He learned to mend a broken fence post, to gentle a skittish horse, to sit in the quiet of the evening and listen to the sounds of a living, growing homestead. He was learning to grow more than just corn and hay. In the silent, sun-drenched hours of hard labor, he was learning to grow hope. His hands, though still rough and scarred, were no longer just the hands of a killer. They were the hands of a builder. They were hands that could cradle a newborn calf, that could build a bookshelf for his wife, that could hold her in the dead of night when the shadows grew too long. But the past was not a docile beast. It was a predator that waited for moments of weakness. One night, deep in the heart of their first winter, a blizzard descended, isolating them in a world of white silence. The wind howled with the voice of old ghosts, and the memories it carried found their way into the warmth of the cabin. Eloise awoke to the smell of fear. Cassian was not in their bed. She found him sitting by the fire, which had burned down to embers, his body rigid, shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with the cold. He was staring into the dying flames, but she knew he was not seeing them. He was seeing another fire. A decade in the past, he was hearing a child's screams over the roar of the blaze. The nightmare had followed him out of sleep and into the waking world, and it had him in its grip. She did not speak. She simply went to him and knelt on the cold floorboards before him. She took his trembling hands in hers, her touch a silent anchor in his storm. He did not seem to register her presence, his eyes wide and unseeing, lost in the inferno of his memory. She leaned forward and gently, reverently, she kissed the puckered, round scar near his collarbone. Then she kissed the long, pale line that sliced across his ribs. She kissed each mark, each testament to a life of violence and pain, not to erase them, but to accept them, to claim them as part of the man she loved. "You dragged me from the dark, Cassian," she whispered, her lips against his skin, her breath warm against the chill of his terror. "And I will keep pulling you out, too, every time." Slowly, slowly, the shaking began to subside. He blinked, and his eyes focused on her face, seeing her as if for the first time. The ghosts receded, pushed back by the fierce, gentle light of her presence. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding onto her as a drowning man holds onto life itself. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other together in the heart of a winter storm. Months passed. Spring arrived, and with it, a green so vibrant it seemed to promise that anything could be made new again. Their love grew, not in a perfect storybook way, but fiercely, like a wildflower finding purchase in rocky soil. It was a love burnished by hardship, tested by fire, and strengthened by a shared, unspoken understanding of the darkness they had both survived. One afternoon in late April, Jedediah Smith rode out to their valley, his face etched with worry. A young woman from a ranch on the far side of the county had died giving birth to her first child. Her husband, a boy himself, was consumed by a grief so profound he could not bear to even look at the infant who had cost him his wife. The baby, a healthy boy, had no one. Eloise and Cassian looked at each other. There was no discussion, no debate. There was only a quiet, immediate certainty. They rode with Jedediah to the lonely, grief-stricken ranch and returned with a small, squalling bundle wrapped in a worn wool blanket. That evening, Cassian stood by the hearth, holding the infant in his arms. The baby was so small, so fragile. His tiny, perfect hands curled around Cassian's calloused finger. Eloise watched him, her heart aching with a love so immense it felt as if it might break her open. She saw the ghost of Samuel in his eyes, the deep, ancient pain of the brother he could not save. But now, that pain was mingled with a new, tentative wonder. This was a chance he never thought he would have, a chance to protect, to nurture, to offer a life of peace to a child who had started his own in the shadow of death. The story ends as it began. At the edge of the canyon, it is late summer, a year after the trial. The sun is setting, a great, molten ball of orange that bleeds across the horizon, setting the clouds ablaze. The wind is just a soft whisper now, a gentle sigh. Cassian stands behind Eloise, his arms wrapped around her back pressed against his chest. In the crook of her arm, the baby boy they have named Samuel sleeps, his breathing soft and even. They are looking out over the vast expanse, the place of their beginning. It is no longer a place of fear, but a place of profound, staggering beauty. Cassian leans his chin on her shoulder, his lips close to her ear. "This time," he whispers, his voice thick with an emotion he does not need to name. No one is falling. She leans back into the solid, unshakable strength of his embrace. A tremor runs through her, but it is not a tremor of fear or of cold. It is a deep, quiet shudder of peace, a feeling she had once believed was lost to her forever. "Only rising," she replies. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.